The word decadence often conjures negative connotations. Originally it was used to mark the late Roman period, where societal disintegration and self-indulgence coexisted in a happy confluence. In our time it has become a signifier of moral collapse, summoning images of licentious debauch, a failure of self-control, and the tarnishing of dignity. Decadence in the arts, however, refers to an oft-overlooked phase of creative activity that found expression in the dwindling lights of the 19th century, a period much like our own that was gripped in the throes of transition. These artists held that only through creation could fallen creatures capture a semblance of respite in a fallen world, and they sought this emancipation through the courtship of extreme themes which at once spoke to their sense of longing for another world, while simultaneously reflecting the unsightly realities of life that polite society neglected. This will be the first of 3 videos dealing with the subject of cultural decadence. Each will examine various aspects of the decadent perspective and why I think these perspectives warrant a broader examination. Though my intention with this video are as follows. Firstly, to give a concise overview of the predominant sentiments and themes that preoccupied the decadent artists, and ground this in a historical context as to why this was important to them. And secondly, I wish to leave the viewer with the impression that despite being regarded as a footnote in the developments of art history, decadence has far more to teach us about our experience of modernity than we might realise. In fact, I'd go as far to say that decadence is one of the only historical art movements that still offers relevant insight into the realities of our period and where we might be heading in the future. Art does not arise from a vacuum. It emerges from the conditions of the soils it grew up in. Every work of art is the result of the talents and limitations of the artist, yet it also bears the mark of a certain period, a certain time, whose peculiar circumstances characterized its development. And decadence was no different. It, like any other, was the product of its own age. So before we go on to study the anatomy of decadent art directly, it's important that we first understand the topography of its times. The 19th century ushered in many radical changes. Slavery was, for the most part, abolished. Science became its own profession as an outgrowth of natural philosophy. Darwin gave us his Origin of the Species, completely rewriting the way that we conceive of ourselves as living creatures. And in Vienna, Sigmund Freud opened up new caverns of conception with his revelation of the unconscious. The French polymath Gustave Le Bon wrote of this period, "The present time is one of those critical moments when human thinking begins to transform itself. The basis of this regeneration consists of 2 main factors. The first is the disintegration of the religious, political and social opinions from which all the elements of our civilization derive. The second is the emergence of completely new existential and intellectual conditions caused by modern discoveries in the natural sciences and industry. Even though the beliefs of the past are already shaken, they still have great influence. The ideas which are to replace them are in the process of being created, and therefore the present time represents a period of transition and anarchy." Transition always brings with it a consciousness of contrasts. Contrasts between the old and the new, between the known and the unknown, between the objective and the subjective, between the radical and the traditional, between the organic and the artificial, and between life and death. The consciousness of contrasts held within the throes of transition and societal transformation formed the bed of life into which the seeds of decadence were planted, and as new flowers arose from old wounds, this signalled a demand for new styles of depiction. Now I think it would be a good idea to look at some developments from the world of art. There are arguably many other patterns that we could reference here, but I think that the three principal developments that helped to foster the onset of decadence were Romanticism, Symbolism, and Naturalism. All of these patterns were either outgrowths from or reactions to the ascendance of Enlightenment thought in the culture. This period had seen an effort to incorporate art into a rationalistic framework whose outlook privileged the objective over the subjective, and also encouraged the view that art should only deal with the explicitly observable, and in a style of depiction that did not deviate from the ways that phenomena presented themselves. This was done in an effort to turn art into a reflection of the scientific endeavour to read accuracy into the natural world. What's more, the same standards that we apply to understand the natural world might also be applied to art, giving art over to a fully rational enterprise. However, this effort to rationalise creativity only amounted to the negative effects of a rapidly modernising world. Many felt that man's intuitive relationship with art was being subject to a sterilisation and desacralisation that paralleled the deprivations felt under industrial expansion. So this prelude to decadence, what postmodern art critic Jan Białystok called a positive crisis in modernity, would open up new vistas for creativity by freeing the artist from the formal restraints of the academy and aligning them to a more individualistic and subjective orientation. Regarded by some as a counter-Enlightenment ideal, the Romantics found the negative relegation of subjectivity distasteful and sought to re-emphasise a world beyond reason's gates. Strong emotions in art, poetry and music became fashionable. Nature was venerated as a transcendent escape from the drudgery of everyday existence, and what's more, a new emphasis on the inner life of the individual came into view. With Romanticism saw the declaration of the artist's inner vision, the notion that what arose from the inner life of the artist was inseparable from its manifestation, and was worthy of consideration as much as the art itself. This was the birth of a view that united art and artist, so that one could never be thought of without the other. It's commonplace these days to hear artists talk about their lives through their work, but in the period which knew Romanticism, it was a startling new proposition, which altered the way that we regard creativity forever. Symbolism and naturalism were also precursors to decadence. Striding out from its subjective position, the symbolists claimed that reason could only take the human mind so far, and that there will always be other dimensions to life that cannot be so easily cordoned by clear language. They believed in the esoteric reality of a primal unity that underlay all of life's appearances. Thereby, through evocative representation, could the human mind be made aware of these so-called primordial truths, whilst never being able to fully comprehend them. Symbolism can also be understood as a flight into the landscape of dreams and the subconscious, in search of a lost paradise whose longing reflects a disillusionment with ordinary life. Humans always feel that they are more than just lumbering robots, more than mere drones of some commercial enterprise or empire. They always possess within them another continent, so to speak, a continent of subjective forms that are often related to with the same degree of authenticity as a tangible subject. And if the everyday world should prove unbearable, then soon enough this inner world will appear as a garden of sanctuary, and the man of industry will surrender willingly to the perfumed mists of nostalgia for some other world, some other place, our own private Arcadia which radiates the promise of a spiritual centre we intuitively feel modernity has stolen from us. The symbolists also rejected the persuasion that art should depict life realistically, A deformed world could be depicted in a deformed way. Also realise that whilst Western art was not immune to depicting negative subject matter, this was usually done in the surface of some grander scheme like the fall of Rome or some mythological topic. It was rare, if ever, to witness a work of art honestly depicting the underbelly of society. This was eventually adopted by the development of naturalism. Naturalism, unlike the others that we've mentioned, saw itself in alignment with the scientific endeavours of the age. However, this carried over to societal depiction in a new way. The naturalists believed that by preferring natural scenes over the life of the urban, this was in a sense a masquerade for life's other realities. Mankind did not exist in a garden of idyls. The world also contained many discomforting things that, in the spirit of radical honesty, ought to be accounted for as well. We see here how the Enlightenment initiative to speak to truth had outgrown its own utopian narratives, and had now become aligned to the problematic realities that it had helped to foster. This encouraged an emphasis on those many unsightly aspects of life which came as a consequence of modernization. Naturalism moved towards the portrayal of ever more tragic themes of critical situations: prostitution, alcoholism, drug dependency, violence and death. However, this brutally honest depiction of the pains of contemporary life further contributed to the feelings of emptiness and alienation, forcing return flights back into the realms of imaginative fantasy, however resplendent or morbid. So before we move on to address decadence directly, let's review all of the key elements and bring them to synthesis. We have a world in transition, the consciousness of contrasts, pessimism towards society and humanistic progress, emphasis on individuality and subjective experience, flights into exotic fantasy as an escape from reality, and an honest acceptance of the unsightly and tragic face of life. And now it is the juncture between the three developments of Romanticism, symbolism and naturalism that is the centre of our attention. The first art to be referred to as Decadence did not come until the publication of a single book in France by Charles Baudelaire titled Les Fleurs du Mal, or in English, The Flowers of Evil. Baudelaire reappropriated the word from its original pejorative sense to describe the late Roman decline, and used it to signify a poignant reality, that art is germ-like, and whilst chaos, instability and excess may be associated with societal collapse, such conditions secure the perfect breeding ground for the flourishing of new art. Since we've already covered a lot of history already, I don't see it appropriate to extend this to a wider assessment of art that could be considered decadent throughout the world. Safe to say that, despite its formative developments occurring in nations like France and Bohemia, its influence spread to shores as wide as the United States, Great Britain, and even Russia. What I would prefer to do is focus on the predominant themes and persuasions of the decadent artists, starting with how the decadents stood in relation to the movements that preceded them. Like a fratricidal rebellion of the young gods against the old, the decadents rejected the very developments it was facilitated by, while simultaneously channeling their patterns in a new direction. From the incredible book Decadence, Art and the Idea of Decadence in the Bohemian Lands, the French novelist and art critic Joris Karl Huysmans described decadence as a flight into a distant dream, as a picture of the innermost self destroyed by hysteria for which the tragic vision of an artist finds in themes of horrors, corruption, complicated nightmares, and cruel visions. So here we can clearly see that the symbolist retreat into inner space is still present, as is the naturalistic confrontation with the ugly side of life. However, the Decadents were not merely interested in an honest depiction of life in all its splendour and squalor. Their preference was to move beyond all of this towards a new union of contrasts between the wonders of high exotica and the lower renditions of the macabre. As children of the transition, the Decadents pushed the consciousness of contrast to extreme limits, savouring madness and irrationality as an elixir to the rationalistic sensibilities of the day, and enthusiastically engaging with taboo themes which polite society looked down upon, such as death, excess, occultism, hallucinations, and a cosmic pessimism which saturates much of what could be considered decadent art from this period. Though the Decadents were not completely bleak in their outlook, they loved the fantastical and the wildly imaginative, and anything which held to a kind of romantic mysticism for the other and distant lands. They also acknowledged the unique side of beauty that can sometimes be captured in the grotesque. Mythological creatures and strange beings greatly impressed upon the Decadents, and they seem to have a great penchant for the Sphinx. A closer examination of this motif reveals why. The Sphinx is on one hand the remaining vestige of a distant civilization now fallen to ruin. So here we have the romantic dispensation for remote and mysterious lands, intermingling with this melancholy sense of loss which spoke to their sense of place in modernity. The Sphinx is also reflective of the consciousness of contrasts. It is at once beautiful, surreal, and seductive, whilst at the same time possessing a tremendous power that can wreak havoc upon mankind. Ghouls and vampires and all manner of monstrous legion are typically regarded with an ambivalence which fails to comprehend their longevity. The monster does not have to be real in a literal sense, for its persistence as a psycho-cultural construct lingers on in an undead fashion to both haunt and fascinate the minds of the living. When life itself becomes interpreted as monstrous, so too do such beings stalk into consciousness. Despite their general pessimism, the Decadents held to a more favourable view of women, especially in those aspects of the feminine where she is sacralised as the embodiment of mysterious and dangerous powers, such as witches, or in the tale of the dancer Salome. Salome is the tale of an exotic dancer in the court of King Herod. Her dancing was so impressive that as a reward the king said that she could ask for anything she wanted. In return, she demanded the severed head of John the Baptist. Many people are also unaware that the Decadents popularised the femme fatale, a breed of feminine anti-hero who always meets a tragic end. The image of Cleopatra in full regalia with a poisonous asp held to her breast is a perfect illustration of the decadent sentiment. Also is the image of the Medusa. This motif is commonly handed down to us in the guise of simple monstrosity, but for the Decadents, the Medusa became something of a martyr figure for them, for they saw in her a loneliness and desperation which mirrored their own sense of estrangement from life. Due to their preference for effect over technique, the Decadents were ambivalent towards the visual logic of the natural world. They had an open-door policy towards style which is reflected in the diversity of depiction in decadent art, and also accounts as to why it's sometimes confusing to categorise against other branches such as symbolism, which also shared a similar dispensation for style and subject. This aesthetic individualism was matched in a strong desire to discover their own spiritual experiences. Developments in the fledgling program of psychoanalysis had revealed that all humans, not merely those marked as divine visionaries or the insane, were capable of acquiring such experiences. By the time of the mid-19th century, secret associations for the ingestion of narcotics were cropping up all over Europe. Substances such as morphine, opium, and even absinthe were unveiling new spiritual worlds and sublime paradises of inner space. The fantastic realm was no longer the frozen prisoner of the image. Now such realities were available to anyone who had the means. In states of intoxication, the boundary between the dream and the real was lost, and with it a feeling of liberation was captured from a world of industrial servitude. But the price to be paid was severe, for with the possibility of respite came with it the inevitable sting of dependence to an even harsher master, addiction. In their search for lost paradise, many now found themselves caught between two hells. In literature, Decadence took on a similar style to its imagistic counterparts. Decadent poetry and literature evolved from the romantic taste for passionate flourish, and favoured a style that emphasised effect over logical description, which eventually became a strong tenet in the development of modernism. Whereas another author might incorporate religion to give a wider account of the narrative, the Decadents would simply appropriate the religious subject as an aesthetic vehicle to emphasise the impact of description. Many traditional writers saw this as an offensive corruption. Decadent literature was often criticised as being superficial or nonsensical by readers accustomed to a more orthodox approach, but one could question as to whether they were ever the target audience. These artists were really creating for themselves, and had little aspiration towards fame or wealth. In a concise statement that matched both the decay and exuberance of decadent writing, the British poet Arthur Symons called it a new and beautiful and interesting disease. This has been an introduction to some of the major patterns and themes that saw the rise of decadence in the 19th century. The next video will focus on what is probably the most principal tenet of decadent art, that is, their belief in the supremacy of the human creative will as a vehicle to escape the trappings of a fallen world. But for now, we'll simply close on this summary. This great confluence of transitional instability, late-century gloom, and a disillusionment with society's failure to produce an enlightened, progressive society, combined with the necessity to reinterpret the unsightliness and horrors of modern life through the lenses of subjective interpretation, gave way to a new budding of artistic life that we could call decadence. Decadence was always more than just another art movement in the procession of styles and shifting currents of taste. It was an anarchistic outcry against the ascended machine, the revenge of the sensuous body against its extensions which were nested inside a conspiracy to silence its demands for expression. That it happened in this way cannot simply be put down to the joy of rebellion or a tricksterish impulse to cause offence. There was, I think, a very serious observation going on within the decadent pattern that saw industrial progress as something of a spiritual blight, which in its own grim majesty eclipsed all of the horrors, vampires, and depictions of tragedy they exonerated through their art. And so in turning to confront such topics rather than submit to them, these artists not only captured a semblance of life in a more honest and radical light than the naturalists, they also put themselves in touch with a primacy that the primordial truths of the symbolists could only point to. In becoming the shadows of enlightened modernity, the decadents not only reflected the conditions of its existential malaise better than any other, they finally found for themselves, perhaps, a disease worth living for.